Ugh.
Mrs. Pumphrey. Tricky has become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage.
Bloated sausage, swollen meat.
His eyes are bloodshot, and his tongue is lolling from his jaws.
He was so tired, Mr. Harriot. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So, I have been giving him some extras between meals, to build him up. Some malt, and cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks at night, to make him sleep. Nothing much really.
And did you cut down on the sweet things, as I told you?
Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be weak. So I had to give him. He does love cream cakes and chocolates. I can't refuse him.
I looked down at the dog. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never refused food. He would eat meal at any hour of the day, giving him plenty of exercise.
Well, he has little walks with me, as you can see. But, Hodgkin, the gardener, has been down with lumbago, so there has been no ring throwing lately.
Lumbago, back pain.
Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food down and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. You must harden your heart, and give him a strict diet.
I will, Mr. Harriot. I'm sure you're right. But it is so difficult, very difficult.
Tricky had a whole wardrobe of tweed coats for the cold weather, and a raincoat for the wet days. I thought it wouldn't take Mrs. Pumphrey long to call me. I was sure Tricky will get more ill. I got the call within a few days. Hello.
Mr. Harriot. Tricky is eating nothing, not even his favorite dishes. Besides, he has had bouts of vomiting. He spends all his time lying on a rug. He doesn't go for walks.
I had made plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. Mrs. Pumphrey. Tricky needs to be hospitalized for about a fortnight, to be kept under observation.
Fortnight, 2 weeks.
What? Tricky would die, if he doesn't see me every day.
Tricky is very ill, and this is the only way to save him. When I marched out to the car, carrying the dog, the maids rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, night bed, favorite cushions, toys, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. As I started to drive away, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a cry, threw some coats through the window. I looked in the mirror. Everybody was in tears. Poor old lad. You haven't a kick in you. But I think I know a cure for you. At the surgery, the dogs moved around me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes. He lay motionless when put down on the carpet. The other dogs sniffed him for a few seconds, and decided he was an uninteresting object. I made up a bed for him in a warm loose box, next to the one where the other dogs slept. I kept an eye on him for 2 days, giving him no food, but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third day, he began to make sounds, when he heard the dogs in the yard. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out. He was immediately surrounded by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting Tricky, the dogs moved to the garden. Tricky followed them. Later that day, I was present at the feeding time. While Tristan poured the food into the bowls, there was the usual rush and sounds of high-speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind, he would get less food. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk around the bowls, clicking inside 1 or 2. Means, now he wanted to eat. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medical treatment of any kind. But all day, he ran about with the dogs. He became an accepted member of the gang. A silly object among the crew, fighting like a tiger at meal times, and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He never had such a time in his life. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey waited anxiously, ringing 12 times a day for the latest updates. I avoided the questions, like whether his cushions were being turned regularly, or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that Tricky was out of danger and was convalescing rapidly.
Convalescing, recovering.
The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 24 at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each, for the breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation dawned upon the household. She sent the wine to enrich Tricky's blood. But now, we would drink 2 glasses of wine before the meal. After that, Mrs. Pumphrey began sending the brandy. So, for a few nights, it was respectfully drunk. They were days of deep content. The days starting with the eggs in the morning, improved by the midday wine, and finishing by the brandy. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest. I wanted the eggs, wine and brandy every day. But I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering. After a fortnight, I had to phone her. Hello, Mrs. Pumphrey. Tricky has recovered. Please come and fetch him. Yes.
Oh, Mr. Harriot, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?
Yes, he is fine. There's no need to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him. I walked into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round the lawn, and their midst was the little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a hard-muscled animal. I carried him to the front of the house.
Ooh.
I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats and bowls, none of which had been used.
Chauffeur, driver.
As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled.
Oh, Mr. Harriot. How can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery.
Why did Mrs. Pumphrey say that it was a triumph of surgery? Although Tricky did not have surgery, Mrs. Pumphrey called Tricky's recovery a triumph of surgery. It was because she was grateful for the medical care that James Harriot gave to Tricky. Mrs. Pumphrey may have used the word surgery to refer to all the different ways that James Harriot helped Tricky feel better. Please like and share the video, and subscribe my channel for more videos like this.